A few years ago, shortly before we came here to start the gate, I was reading an article about a pastor who had a very creative idea. He was called into a church that was old, that had grown tired, that had grown weary, that was a bit worn out from all the stuff that churches do and are and become. A church that had been around for decades, if not 100 years. And this church out in West Texas had reached a point where something had to give, something had to change. And so what this pastor did was he said, you know what? We cannot continue on as a church as we are. The church is dry bones. It's nothing. There's nothing left to it. There's nothing going on. So it's time for it to die. And so what he did was he created an elaborate situation. He had an obituary filed in the paper for the church. They held a funeral service for the church. He bought a large casket and he marched it up to the front. He had pallbearers that were deacons. And they had a funeral service and laid the church to rest. So that once the church had been laid to rest and all of the trappings and all of the names and everything that had been attached to it, all the emotions that that church had about itself, that community had about that church, he could say, our end is here. It's finished. The door is closed. We're going to start over. And he restarted the church. Every membership roll was wiped out. So in order to be a member of that church, one had to join it again. If you were a deacon for the church, you were no longer a deacon. You had to become one. You had to earn the right to be a servant of the church with that title, with that name. No more elders. Again, you had to be started over. Everything started from scratch. There was new vision. The theology stayed the same, but so much of the rest of the structure of the church would change. And what it did was two things. One, in the eyes of the community, it said, hey, they're different. They're starting fresh. They want a fresh start. In the eyes of the church, it was a breath of life. I tell you that story because many of us are at that point right now in our lives, our personal lives, that we're ready to start fresh. Students, it's the end of the semester, end of the year. Summer is beckoning you. Internships, vacations, summer school, other things, beaches, going to the mountains to hike, backpacking, whatever it may be. It's right there. You need that because you are bone dry of inspiration and hope and goodness. For the rest of us who live in the real world, no offense, but summer doesn't really mean that except for the fact that maybe in the afternoons you can go home and you can go swim in the pool. You can, lay out and just relax for a little bit. The evenings are warm, so you sit by the air conditioning and you have a nice cool glass of tea or lemonade or something, and people still do those sort of old-timey things. But the fact is, there's something about summer that still speaks to life. Even in Texas, where summers get to be 138 degrees. I mean, okay, it's a little elaborate. It's 136. But it still gets to be hot here. But there's still life. There's something about the sound of children who are no longer trapped in school, running up and down the street, riding their bikes, and jumping in the pool, and whatever kids do in the summer these days. It just says life is here. And even if you were stuck in an office or you're sitting behind a desk and you hear that sound, or you hear the sound of the ice cream truck going down the road. I actually heard that the other day and I was kind of like, really? They can still do that? But there was life. There was life coming around. As individuals, we're feeling that sort of drought. We're feeling that tiredness. As a church, for the last 6 months or so, maybe even longer, we've felt that same sort of dryness. The passage that Neil read, Ezekiel chapter 37, is about God's chosen people reaching that point, just being worn out. They're tired. They have been fighting his battles. They have been seeking him, sometimes doing well by him, sometimes really getting on his nerves. They've lived, and they are worn out as believers. I don't know if you've ever personally been in that dry spot of spiritual apathy or spiritual just exhaustion, that it's hard to get up in the morning and say a prayer, that it's hard to read the scriptures at all, that it's hard to even think about God. I've been there. And I spent a good number of the last few years going in and out of that dry space. I have been those very things that Ezekiel has described in that passage. These bones that were just dry. And there would be moments where it would seem like the flesh would begin to grow back and the tendons would begin to grow back, and I'd begin to stand up and the dryness would just knock me down again. Just wipe me out. I would get a little bit of hope and I would be crushed by it. And it's really hard to trust that God's got life for you when everything you encounter seems to suck life out of you. It's hard. Guys, a lot of you are still young and you're still at that point where you haven't had a whole lot of failures. You haven't had a whole lot of things really go wrong. And you have. Some of you have. Some of you have been in tight situations. Some of you have been in places that I don't envy years beyond where you are. But very few of you have looked in the face of a child, your child, knowing that they were sick and there was nothing you could do about it. Very few of you have maybe looked into the eyes of a dying parent. Some of you may have lost a job, but you haven't lost a career. Some of you have been in terrible accidents, and others have lost friends and loved ones. Whatever you have been through, I want you to know life is going to get worse before it gets better. And I'm not just saying that because I really want to bum you out. But it does. In fact, I want to throw out the idea of this, that I think sometimes in order for God to get us to understand that He is good, and He is what we need, and He is what we should long for, I think sometimes He allows us to fail spectacularly. I think that sometimes God allows us to lose things, to be in doubt about our security, especially our financial security. So that God can say, I'm still here, and I'm still a giver of life. The beautiful thing about the story of Ezekiel and the dry bones is this, is that Ezekiel comes upon this valley where soldiers have been killed and left. Their bodies weren't picked up. They just died there. Their flesh rotted away over time, and there was nothing but these bones there. They gave everything they had, and they still lost. I feel that way so often, is that I give everything I have, and yet I still lose. I don't get ahead. I feel like there are times where I look at things and I look at the game and I go, man, we've given so much to this, we've done so many things, why hasn't it exploded? Why hasn't it blossomed? And I die on that moment. And I wonder what's going on. And how can I possibly have the energy to go another year of this? There are times that I get totally disappointed when I plan something and nothing really comes of it. And it's in those moments that I am dry bones laying on the floor of the desert with nothing in me. The beauty of this story is those bones are not brought back to life by a motivational speaker or by reading a really cool quote on Facebook or brought back to life by following a certain set of steps to find true fulfillment in life. Those bones are brought back to life because God speaks to them and flesh grows back and tendons grow back and they stand upright. And even then, they're still not alive. Those bones rise up and they're standing in formation. The soldiers who were slain, who gave everything and still lost, are standing there and they're yet still not alive. They look alive. They have the bones covered in flesh, covered in muscle, probably covered in clothes, I'm assuming. He's brought them back. They're standing there. They look alive, but they are not alive. And guys, I've been there too. I've been in that place where I look alive and I act alive and I put on my show and I put on my facade that, yeah, I've got everything. I'm cool. Everything's happy. Everything's great. When inside, there is no life. And there are so many Christians that I know of who go through that. They will never let you know that they are hurting. They will never let you know that the fact that their job is about to lay them off is scaring them to death. They will never let you know that they are worried that their loved one, their wife or their husband could walk out the door any minute. They will never let you know that they are terrified that their kids are going to grow up to be disappointments. They are terrified that there's not going to be enough money to cover the mortgage or the bills or that purchase they just made. They are terrified of being found out that they are in fact full of flesh, full of bone, but not at all full of life. They are terrified of you finding out that deep down, their relationship with God that they talk about like it's the greatest thing on earth is really just a bunch of smoke and mirrors. The story doesn't end with those bones being raised up to standing armies. It's then when God says, prophesy to the breath. He asked Ezekiel, he says, Ezekiel, ask for life. See, we can ask for everything to look okay and everything to be good, but until we look in the face of God, until we seek God and say, God, give me life, there is no life in us. I want you to understand, life doesn't come from anyone or anything but God. Life is found in Him through Christ. About 10 years ago, I graduated from Texas A&M. 10 years ago in about 2 weeks. And about 10 years ago, in about 4 months, I took off to seminary. And I didn't want to go. I say took off. I was dragged kicking and screaming to seminary. And we'll admit that probably my negative feelings about seminary sort of tainted before I even got there what happened while I was in seminary. But at the same time, it was a very dry experience. It was a very spiritually dry experience. It was getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning or 4:30 in the morning and driving 2.5 to 3 hours from my home to Fort Worth to go to class, sitting in class from 8 o'clock in the morning until 4 o'clock at night, and then driving home 2.5 to 3 hours, doing that once a week, and sitting in classes where some of the professors hadn't been in a church in 50 years. Some of them had been in church for a while, but they were so arrogant and pompous that they didn't see what was going on, that they had sort of a situation that wasn't real to those of us in smaller churches. And it was hard. And I didn't feel like I was growing spiritually, and I was looking at what I was learning there, and I was going, man, when I was in college, I learned so much more about who Christ was than I had ever learned in any of these classes in seminary. And I will be honest, to this day, I still say that. I learned more about who Christ was sitting in a men's discipleship class outside of Dixie Chicken than I did in 4 years, or excuse me, 2 years of seminary. I'm trying to add to my degree. I tell enough people I was there 4 years, then you tell the truth. I learned more sitting in an hour-long Bible study with a couple of guys under the age of 22 outside of a bar. And I learned from doctors and professors who have walked with Christ for so many years in the full 2 years that I was at seminary. But there was one thing that came out of seminary that was amazing to me. I was in there one morning and I was waiting for class to start. I got there a little bit early and I was sitting on this comfortable couch and I was reading a book or something, and just this phrase kept coming into my mind. It was this phrase of a spring of life welling up. And it's not exactly a biblical phrase. Jesus says things like, I will become a spring of water that you'll never go thirsty. And there's other passages that talk about a spring of water welling up inside of you, a spirit of life welling up inside of you. But it was just this idea of God wants me to be a well of life. And I'm like, that sounds very poetic and very cool. And it sounds like a great quote. What does it mean? And I've spent the last 10 years thinking about that. What does it mean to be a well of life? In the book of 2 Corinthians, we have a great couple of verses here that we're going to look at. 2 Corinthians chapter 4. And One of my favorite bands takes their names from this passage, Jars of Clay. But then there's other things in here too. There's other great songs that have been written about this passage. And I think it's there for a reason. Because like Ezekiel